All right, staying in Washington now, where Democrats have intensified their impeachment inquiry. Top state officials, David Hale, State Department official rather, David Hale is expected to testify today, and Democrats could release more transcripts from key witnesses.
This comes after lawmakers released Gordon Sondland's bombshell testimony yesterday. In a reversal from his original deposition, the ambassador to the EU admitted the U.S. froze military aid for Ukraine as officials pushed the country to investigate President Trump's political rival, Joe Biden. Nancy Cordes is following all of this and has more.
It's never too late to do the right thing.
Democrats applauded Sondland for amending his testimony to say that he does now recall telling a Ukrainian official that aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided a public anti-corruption statement, specifically reopening the investigation into Burisma, the energy company that employed the son of Mr. Trump's campaign rival, Joe Biden.
The State Department was being politicized by the president and essentially being turned into an instrument of his reelection campaign.
Even in his original testimony, Sondland told lawmakers that the pressure campaign, led by the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, kept getting more insidious as time went on. Hardly the exoneration the White House and Republicans had claimed. This is what they said back then.
He was very clear, no quid pro quo multiple times.
Go look at what Gordon Sondland said today in his testimony.
Now Republicans are downplaying Sondland's role.
You're wanting to focus on Ambassador Sondland instead of focusing on Ambassador Volker, who was the Ukrainian envoy.
But Volker, whose testimony was released too, described the president's demand for dirt on Biden as extremely unfortunate for our policy with Ukraine. Still, Senate Leader Mitch McConnell suggested that wasn't enough to merit impeachment.
If it were today, I don't think there's any question it would not lead to a removal.
Nancy Cordes is with us now from Capitol Hill, while Ben Tracy joins us now from the White House. Nancy, I'm going to start with you. Gordon Sondland has been considered an ally of President Trump and Republicans. However, now that he does his testimony, is that going to help Democrats prove that there actually was abuse of power by the president?
Sure, because not only is he at least the fifth witness to explicitly say that there appeared to be a quid pro quo here, but also he is a witness who, as you mentioned, was dedicated to President Trump. He got his ambassadorship because he donated $1 million to the president's inaugural committee. He is a lifelong Republican and hotel magnate who was clearly trying to get the Ukrainians to do what he knew the president wanted, which was to promise that they would investigate the Bidens, promise that they would look into the possibility that Ukraine had somehow been involved in election meddling in 2016 and not the Russians. And so the fact that Sondland himself is now saying, yes, there was a quid pro quo, and that Sondland himself delivered the message about that quid pro quo, that he spoke to a top Ukrainian official and told that official that they weren't going to get this military aid that had been held up mysteriously until they announced these investigations. That, Democrats believe, is a significant step forward.
And Ben, I guess facing perjury charges, possible penalties for that, it jars your memory real quick. And I'm guessing, as Nancy points out, since he donated $1 million to the Trump inaugural committee, that the president knows him, unlike Ambassador Yovanovitch. But are they worried at all about Sondland's newly released testimony? It does seem more and more that Republicans are saying, yeah, there was probably a quid pro quo, as Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, said, but it's not impeachable.
You are hearing some Republicans say that, but you're really not hearing the president say that very often. And the White House, really, in the face of Ambassador Sondland describing and acknowledging this quid pro quo, is doubling down on saying there was no quid pro quo. We just heard from Kellyanne Conway, a senior advisor to the president, and she repeated those very words. They're seizing on this idea that they believe Ambassador Sondland, or at least they're arguing Ambassador Sondland, was presuming that the reason the military aid was withheld was because of these investigations, but that even he acknowledges he doesn't exactly know who or when or why that aid was suspended. So that's what the White House is seizing on this morning. But as you say, this has kind of been a choose-your-own-adventure defense. There has been the no quid pro quo defense, but then some White House officials, Mick Mulvaney and the president once, at least, have said, well, you know, even if there was, it's not that big of a deal. I can do that, and it's not impeachable.
To that end, let's continue this discussion. Republicans have now started to downplay Sondland's testimony and his role in the Ukraine controversy. Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham weighed in on it, calling the whole process BS. Let's hear what he had to say.
It doesn't matter whether he testifies in public or not. If the person being threatened with withholding the aid, if they say I wasn't threatened, I don't care what any bureaucrat says. If the president of the Ukraine says, and he keeps saying, no, I did not feel that I had to do anything to get the aid.
So you feel this changes nothing in your view?
One, they got the money, and the president of Ukraine is the guy that you would call if you made a case. How do you have a quid pro quo when the person who is the subject of the pro said it didn't happen?
So Nancy, I think I hear yet another strategy moving forward, another attempt
adventure.
at a defense.
Another
right.
choose your adventure.
So he's saying that, you know, Ukraine didn't feel like there was any pressure in any way. So if they didn't feel pressure, then there must not have been pressure. So none of this matters.
Well, that's actually incorrect, what Lindsey Graham is saying. Multiple Ukrainian officials, according to these witnesses, felt a great deal of pressure and told them so, to the extent that they ultimately refused to issue the statement that President Trump wanted because they were so worried about getting dragged into U.S. Domestic politics. Now, did the president of Ukraine tell the president of the United States that he was feeling pressured point blank on that phone call? Did he say that when he was sitting side by side with the president? No, but you wouldn't expect him to with hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid on the line. You wouldn't expect him to try to mess with that spigot by admitting to the world that he felt pressured by the man who controls that spigot. What Republicans are also doing in this sort of choose your own adventure framework that Ben so aptly described is that they're now saying that Sondland doesn't matter that much after all. Originally, they were saying, look at what Sondland's saying. He's saying no quid pro quo. You got to look at his testimony. Now they're saying Sondland's not that important, that it's actually Kurt Volker whose testimony we should read. And I asked Jim Jordan this morning, the Republican who has been defending the president day after day, why is it that we should trust Kurt Volker's testimony as opposed to all the other witnesses who have said there was a quid pro quo? And he said, well, Volker was a special envoy. He's highly respected. I said, all these other diplomats are highly respected, too. Bill Taylor was the ambassador to Ukraine. He said there was a quid pro quo. And he didn't have much of a response to that. The bottom line is that even the Volker testimony that Republicans are now pointing to as sort of like the best argument for President Trump, it's not an exoneration. It's just that Volker doesn't explicitly use the term quid pro quo. He still describes what went down. He still says that the president's phone call was very problematic for U.S. foreign policy. You know, it's just that he doesn't go quite as far as some of the other witnesses have.
And Nancy, can I ask you just on the point that you made in your back and forth with Jim Jordan, the reports that some of the Republican leadership is thinking about putting some of the president's most vocal defenders onto the Intelligence Committee, like Jim Jordan. How does that work? I mean, I think for those of us who don't cover the Hill, what are the mechanics behind taking a member from one committee and then popping him into another committee expressly for the purposes of, you know, grandstanding, I guess, to the American people when these are televised live?
Well, it wouldn't typically be that easy, except that the Intelligence Committee works a little differently. It's a select committee. It's governed by slightly different rules, which does give the minority leader the opportunity, if he wants to temporarily place Jim Jordan on that committee for the purpose of public hearings, which all signs point to starting next week and then continuing the following week. You know, the fact that he's considering putting Jordan on the committee means he also has to consider taking somebody off. I'm not sure that any Republicans can be raising their hand to be taken off the committee, but their numbers have to stay the same. And so in order to make that switch, he's going to have to disappoint someone else, and we haven't learned yet who that someone else might be if the Republican leader does go this route. But it shows just how high stakes this set of hearings is going to be, not just for Democrats, but for Republicans as well. They really view these hearings as a chance to shape the public view of what exactly went down. They understand that there's still a great deal of confusion, and so both sides have a vested interest in making sure that these hearings go as well for their side as possible.
All right, so Ben, before we let both of you go, just a little bit ago, you asked Kellyanne Conway about the president's scheduled meeting with Turkey's Erdogan set for next week. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, so this visit has long been scheduled by the Turkish president, but it really became problematic a few weeks ago when Turkey invaded Syria, and you had this whole issue of the president pulling American troops out and what that meant for the Kurds. A lot of pushback from both Democrats and Republicans to hosting Erdogan here at the White House. In the last couple of days, though, it's really been the Turkish government that has signaled that perhaps he may not come, and that's in reaction to a congressional resolution about the Armenian genocide. We don't have time to go into all of that, but that offends the Turks, and so he might have not come as a protest. I asked Kellyanne, and it was kind of interesting. She said, well, it's still on the schedule, but we'll see what happens. So one could call that a hedge. One could call that a sign that perhaps all is not well when it comes to that visit.
All right, Nancy and Ben, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
You're welcome.
And remember, if you want to take a deeper dive into what's happening now, including new details that we are learning from the released transcripts, check out our blog at cbsnews.com/impeachment.